Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4 of this course. We're at the point now where hopefully you feel like you have a good foundation of what transition is all about and why it's so important. And then we spent the last 2 weeks really diving into transition assessments as the foundation of a quality and compliant transition plan. So this week, we're really going to dive into all of the components, or essentially all of the sections of the transition plan form that's embedded in the IEP. So there's kind of a lot of moving parts here, and I'm going to point out what is needed for basic compliance, but know that we always really strive for quality. So I'm going to try to kind of distinguish between those two, but also make them really clear. So if you are, in charge of writing transition plans, and maybe, you aren't right now because you're teaching younger students, maybe at some point you will. So I think it's also, just great to understand what is required in transition planning and how to get all of those components correct. So the way that it works, let's say I were to come to your school and pull one of your IEPs that you have developed for a student, and that student is 14 or older. If I were to look at the transition plan, all 8 components would have to be compliant for that whole plan to be considered compliant. And what I mean by that is the Office of Special Education Programs at the federal level sets that compliance for us as a state at 100%. So every year we go out to all different schools in our state, and we pull a sample of transition plans and we evaluate those. And if one component is out of place and not compliant, then that whole plan is considered non-compliant. So I can tell you over time, we've gotten a little bit better at this, but we're probably only at about 60 to 70% compliant for the entire state. And the expectation is that we're 100%. So I can just tell you from the standpoint of, the state and how we're doing in terms of compliance on transition plans, we've got some work to do. So this is definitely an important topic. This might feel a little bit long today, but feel free to, pause this and break it up. I've also added the link to a Padlet that really breaks down all of these 8 areas on the transition plan for you to go back to and reference that in your practice. So let's say you forgot how to do compliant post-secondary goals, for example. You could just go back to that Padlet and just watch a short video on that. So I've also included a tips document. So that is also a great resource to access to go and look when you are developing transition plans, just to kind of double check and just to make sure that you're doing it in a compliant manner. But we're really going to dive in a lot of detail today for that. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so first, what I'm going to do is kind of share with you some videos that we made of a student named Jason. And we created these because we really wanted to show what this process is like with student voice, making sure that the student really is, part of every section of the transition planning process and how they can be. Then we're going to kind of dive in and just learn all of those components and what needs to be in place to meet compliance and quality. And then I want you to also know where to find a lot of these resources, because, I definitely don't expect you to memorize all of this. This definitely takes some time to kind of, feel comfortable with, and that's absolutely expected. This is not just a one and done. So you'll want to reference some of those resources, I think, along the way and when certain things come up for you. So with that, let's watch Jason's video. And hopefully you can all hear the sound. Let me get it started. For some reason, I've lost my play button. Here we go. My computer's just a little slow. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a 10th grader. I live with my parents and sister near my school. I like school, but I'm not that great at it. I work hard, but I need extra help, especially in reading and writing. I can use my computer to read out loud to me, or to type what I say when I need to write something. I'm pretty good at math and history. I really like my history teacher. She makes history super interesting. My math teacher is cool too. He says it's okay to make mistakes and learn from them. I think I might want to be a high school teacher someday. I play basketball with my friends a couple of times a week. I'm not the greatest at it, but it's fun, and I like being with my friends. I also work part-time at my uncle's law office in the afternoons, and sometimes on weekends. My job is to answer the phone and organize files on the computer. I'm a little shy on the phone, but I'm getting better at talking to people I don't know. My uncle gave me a script that I can use for calls. That makes it easier for me. I mostly like the paycheck, but I usually spend it all before the next time I get paid. Well, here's my school. I need to get to class.
Okay, so that essentially is summary of, where is Jason at this moment in time? Jason's 16 years old. That was like a summary of his transition assessments, but it's in his voice. So I wanted to share that with you. Now, this next one is really about his spin. So this is Jason's opportunity to really talk about his strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. So let's watch this one.
Oh, hey, I'm on my way to study skills class. My teacher's a lifesaver, especially with writing assignments. She also helps me make plans for what I want to do after high school. Now that is scary. I mean, I only have 2 more years to figure things out. I get so overwhelmed sometimes that I just can't think about it anymore. Anyway, my teacher talks to me a lot about what I want to do for college and a job. She helps me think about what I'm good at and what interests me, and what I need to succeed in school, and in life in general. Sometimes she has me do these career surveys and explore jobs on the internet to help me learn about my options. And then there's all the stuff about college I need to learn about. It can be overwhelming, but it is nice to have someone there to help walk me through it. Like I said before, being a high school history teacher could be cool. I go to these IEP meetings with my teachers and my parents and other people like my school counselor and my vocational rehabilitation counselor, or VR counselor. I like the meetings because I can talk about things that are important to me. My teacher goes over the results of my assessments before the meeting, so I can understand them and talk about what I'm good at, what I like to do, and what my needs are. My teacher calls those spins. The only thing is, I'm really shy about asking for accommodations in my IEP meetings, so I need help talking about that and setting goals. My parents are busy. I talk to them sometimes about my future when they have time to listen. They really support me doing what I want to do, but sometimes I can't make up my mind. I have a lot to figure out, and I know I need help to do that in the next couple of years. Uh-oh, I gotta get to class.
Okay, so that was Jason talking about his strengths, interests, preferences, and needs. This next one is really kind of talking about his plan for the future. So let's watch this one.
Wow, we just had this great discussion in my study skills class about all the different assessments there are to help me figure out my spins. My teacher said choosing the right assessments should be based on my own vision of what I want for my career, education, and life after high school. I also learned that the people that come to my IEP meetings can actually suggest certain types of assessments, and those can help me set goals for myself that I can work on while I'm still in high school. My teacher also helps me think about who I am, what my talents and interests are, what I want to do in the future, and what options I have in my community to help me prepare for a job. And here are the coolest questions. I'm learning how to figure out what might keep me from succeeding after high school, and how to know when and where I'm at my best, so I can decide what kinds of jobs are best for me. Whoa, I never thought about this stuff before. It feels good, having people in my corner helping me figure things out. Now, I need to figure out how to make it to my next class on time. Oops.
All right, so my hope is those videos will kind of set the stage of how we make sure that we have meaningful student participation throughout this whole process. And as we break down all the components that we'll talk about today, though there are some other Jason videos so that you can see how, again, he is involved in that process and all of the different sections or components of the transition plan. So we are essentially kind of on the second component because we talked a ton about transition assessments, and that's that first one on this chart, that orange box. And now that we have this great rich information that we've gathered about a student from their family and from their perspective, and we use different assessments, we've got a pretty good idea of, okay, what kind of a post-secondary goals should this student have? And this is something we want to develop with students. So we'll talk a little bit about what's needed for compliance around those post-secondary goals. And these are these big future goals. So this flow chart here, I'm going to refer to it a lot because it just really, I think, emphasizes that this is a process, not just a paper to fill out. However, what I do want you to remember is that this process, every single step in this process and all of those components are embedded in your IEP form. So this screenshot, I know it's really hard to see. You don't need to be responsible for, seeing every little part of this, but I wanted to point out that we at USBE, we create a model transition plan form, making sure that all of those required sections are on there, and then school districts themselves choose which type of a IEP platform they want to use. So many of you guys are probably using Embrace, which is a pretty popular form, and that's what this one is. So this is, I just kind of screenshotted what the transition plan form looks like in Embrace, and essentially everything that we require in the model form has to be on whatever platform your school has adopted or your district has adopted. So I think, if you look at your form, you'll see all of these components and where they are and how they align to that colorful chart. So they're not different things. They're exactly the same. They just look different. So I wanted to make sure everyone saw that. And certainly if you have any questions about this, reach out to me for sure, and we can talk through that. So we're going to start with post-secondary goals. Why is it so important? This cartoon, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but it might remind you of many young students who say they want to be a famous athlete or a rock star for their post-secondary goal. But, and that's great that they have interests and dreams, and we don't want to squelch those dreams, but we want to write appropriate, measurable post-secondary goals. So we're going to really go through, how to do that. How do we take a student's interest, especially when they're young and they really don't know what they want to do yet? I'm going to provide you with lots of examples of what is considered a compliant post-secondary goal and what is not compliant. So I'll give you some examples and non-examples. So I think the most important thing to remember around this idea of post-secondary goals is this is the big picture. This is not an annual goal like all of the rest of the goals on the IEP. This really is a future goal. So let's say the student's in 9th grade. We are talking about what they would be doing after they graduate, after they're a senior. So sometimes that's hard to look forward, 4 years, 5 years. These goals can change, right? But we update them annually. So we don't want them to stay the same because we know that students change their minds the more that they, get older and are exposed to different things. So the important thing about these big picture post-secondary goals are they have to be measurable. So we have to be able to kind of imagine seeing the student doing it. And I think that'll be more clear when I show you those examples and those non-examples. So they have to be written in a manner that has an after-school target. So what I mean by that is this goal is not a goal that they're going to accomplish in 10th grade or 11th grade or 12th grade. This is a goal for what they'll be doing after they leave the school. So upon graduation, after services end, there's lots of different ways you can word that, and I'll show you that. And of course, these have to align with that information that we gathered from the assessment. So if the assessment shows that a student's super interested in, working with computers, we wouldn't want a post-secondary goal to reflect something completely different, like that they want to work with trees out in the, in the forest, right? We want them to align with what we have found out through those transition assessments. And then we know that they're probably going to be more general as the student's younger, and then as they get older, these goals are a little bit more targeted and more refined, and I'll provide you lots of examples of what that might look like for an older student versus a younger student. Okay, so how many of these goals do we have to write? Essentially, there has to be at least two. There has to be a post-secondary goal for employment. What will the student do around employment? And then there has to be one for further education and training. So what will the student be doing after graduation in terms of further education and training? It doesn't have to be college. We'll talk about what that might look like. And then there's kind of an optional one for independent living, but we would strongly recommend that all students, could probably benefit from a post-secondary goal around independent living. And again, your transition assessments, if you've assessed for some adult living skills, it probably will show that the student might need some sort of a post-secondary goal and services, around self-advocacy, self-determination. Maybe it's budgeting, maybe it's getting their license, navigating the community, public transportation, right? So don't discount independent living, even though on your IEP form, it will say considered not needed. We have this section called basis for decision. So if you just check the box, oh, this student doesn't need an independent goal, there's this kind of reminder, I think, where it says basis of decision. So what led you to just decide that the student doesn't need an independent living goal? So in other words, did the assessments, pull that out? So let's say you did some assessments around adult living skills and the student, can navigate the community fine. They've got their driver's license, they're making their own lunch. They're kind of in line with, I think, their non-disabled peers around independent living skills, and maybe you don't need one. But I would say in most cases, you're going to want to write one for independent living skills. Okay, so a little more about what this basis of decision part is on the IEP. It is not required for compliance. So in other words, you don't have to put in a reason. It's just there is a reminder. So here's an example. So based on current results of independent living skills assessment data, student does not demonstrate a need for goal. So I think what it does is it kind of reminds you to make sure that you don't just check boxes and that you've been thoughtful about why they didn't need one. The non-example would be, oh, because the student just doesn't need it. But if it's not based on some assessment, then that's really not a great way to just say, oh, they don't need this, right? So that's just kind of a reminder that we want to be really thoughtful about discounting the fact that they don't need an independent living goal. Okay, so let's talk again what needs to be in place around these post-secondary goals for compliance. So of course, at the age 14, when the transition plan must be developed, the student must have at least two post-secondary goals. Again, one in education and training, one in employment, and then independent living where appropriate. The goals must have active language, and I'm going to share with you lots of examples what we mean by that. And it has to have a statement of when it will occur, and it has to occur after the student leaves your school or school district. And they have to be updated annually. So what we wouldn't want to see is the same post-secondary goal just copied and pasted from 8th grade all the way to the senior year, because chances are that student probably has changed their mind. So here's an example of a compliantly written post-secondary goal. After high school, so there's that statement when it's going to occur. After high school, Juan will attend Salt Lake Community College majoring in accounting. So this is an example of a post-secondary goal for education and training. This says what Juan will do after he graduates. He'll attend community college at Salt Lake, and it goes so far as to even say what he's going to major in. Now, not all students know what they want to major in, and that's okay. But so chances are Juan is probably in 11th or 12th grade, and he's narrowed it down quite a bit that he wants to go to this school and that he wants to study that particular area. So that is one example. For a younger student, this might look a little different. They may not know that they want to study accounting, but they may definitely know they want to go to a certain college. So that goal could look slightly different. But again, active language and the statement of when it's going to occur is super important. So we're going to go through more. But first, I want to be really clear about when we write goals, post-secondary goals for education and training, what are we talking about? Of course, we're talking about the traditional four-year colleges. We're talking about two-year colleges. We're talking about tech colleges. The military can also be, education and training goal if a student wants to go into the military. But we have to also remember things like vocational training programs, apprenticeships, internships, digital learning. So if a student wants to get some sort of an IT certificate, or they're doing an online food handler's permit, for example, it's anything that is considered further education and training could be written in this goal, even on the job training. So let's say a student is going to just learn skills on the job, that can be written as a post-secondary goal for education and training. Now let's kind of shift to post-secondary goals for employment. So we always, I think, want to think about competitive integrated employment for students. So what that means is they'll have a job in the community with non-disabled peers, earning a competitive wage, minimum wage or higher. So that's what we talk about when we talk about competitive employment. And I think that's ultimately the goal. But sometimes our students might need supported employment. What that means is they would need a job coach, and that's fine too. You can write that into the post-secondary goal. Customized employment. That's when we kind of carve out part of a job in particular for a student. That's done a lot for students with more complex needs. So that's also considered employment, and you can write a goal for that. And then don't discount self-employment. So if a student wants to start their own little business, you can write a goal for that if that's what they want to do after high school. Or if they have a family business and they'll be working in the family business, that's acceptable too. So these are just kind of shows you all the different forms of employment for students after they leave school. All right, independent living goals, like I said, this can be a long list. There's lots of things under adult living, daily living, healthcare, financial. So if it's, managing their own bank account, that could be a post-secondary goal. Learning to drive the bus or taking the bus by themselves to their college classes, that could be considered an independent living goal. A lot of times when we write self-advocacy goals or social skill goals, interpersonal skills, assistive technology. So there's a lot that can fit under this area of independent living. Of course, you'd have to assess for these areas to really get a good idea of what that post-secondary goal would be like for independent living. But again, I'm going to share lots of examples with you. So hopefully you'll feel more comfortable. Okay, back to compliance a little bit. If I were to look at a file, I would look to see if there were at least 2 post-secondary goals for that student, one for education and training and one for employment. I would look to see that it has active language and that it occurs after high school. And also I would look to see that they've been updated. So they weren't just copied and pasted, from year to year. And were they appropriate? Did they align with what we found out in those transition assessments? So this feels like a lot. I don't want you to be scared, but I will tell you, when I first started writing post-secondary goals, it was hard to wrap my head around it, right? Because I wrote so many annual IEP goals that I got very comfortable writing those, but I couldn't really wrap my head around how to write a goal for those post-secondary goals because they're different. So I was introduced to this kind of formula and it was super helpful and I used it all the time. So kind of fill in the blanks here, right? And then you'll know you'll be compliant. So the first part of this goal would be either after high school, after graduation, after completion of post-high. So let's say the student is staying through age 22 because they're in a post-high program in your school district. You could start writing the goal that way. After post-high school, student will, and that will language, that's the active. Instead of saying should or might or could, we want active language. So that word will works for that. And then the observable behavior, can we actually see the student doing it? So for example, after completion of post-high school, Susie will work in a clothing store with support of a job coach, for example. So can we see her doing that? Theoretically, we could, right? We can't see her doing something if she's just thinking about it or she should do it. So we really want it to be written in active language. And here's lots of examples coming up. After graduation from high school, Maria will be enrolled in cooking classes at the Utah Independent Living Center. So this is a goal for further education and training. The student is going on to use the independent living centers, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are, but there are places where people with disabilities can go and take classes, and she's going to take a cooking class. So that's a further education and training goal. The next one Nate shall attend Wolverines Elevated at Utah Valley University to study art and design after he graduates high school. So again, that when it's going to occur, that after he graduates high school is at the end of the sentence or at the end of the goal, but that's okay as long as it's there. Shall is active language, and it says where he's going to attend college at UVU, and even goes so far as to say that he's going to study, a certain concentration area of art and design. So that's another example of a way you can write a compliant goal for post-secondary education, where he's going to go. The next one, after post-high services, I will work in the music industry with the support of a job coach. So again, the student is staying in their LEA for post-high services, probably aging out at 22. This person wrote it in their own voice. So I will work in the music industry. Maybe they don't know exactly what in the music industry they'll do, and that's okay. And chances are this student might have high support needs, so they'll do that with a supportive job coach. So that's a great example of a post-secondary goal for employment. Then the next one, after graduation, Peter is going to work part-time in the construction industry. It's got all the components needed for a compliant post-secondary goal. It's got when it's going to occur. It's got active language. It says what he'll be doing for employment. It doesn't say whether he's going to be like a carpenter or a plumber. It's not super detailed, but that's okay. This might be a younger student that just knows he wants to work in the construction industry, but hasn't narrowed it down yet. So that's acceptable. And then the last one, after exiting post-high services, Lori will independently make her own lunch each day. So this student probably has more complex needs. They're staying through 22. So the statement is after they leave post-high, they will make their own lunch every day. That's the expectation, right? So that's an independent living goal, a post-secondary independent living goal example. So, gosh, I was going to say something that was relevant to this, and now I've lost it. But anyway, those are all examples of ways that you can write post-secondary goals for students in the areas of employment, further education and training, and some examples of independent living too. Now we're going to talk about some non-examples. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. So notice how these are really different. They don't have criteria. There's no percent correct or, 5 out of 10 trials or things that you would put into an annual goal. None of that is in a post-secondary goal. These are perfect examples of how you would write a post-secondary goals. And so you do not need to include that kind of criteria. I just wanted to make that clear. Okay. Non-compliant post-secondary goals. So what we sometimes see that we would mark non-compliant is Pedro wants to work with animals either at a shelter or a vet office. Couple things wrong with this one. First of all, he wants to work. It's not really active language. It doesn't have a statement of when this goal is going to happen. It's missing that. And it's great information. We know Pedro's interested in animals. So this is information that belongs like in a flap-up statement. This is something that you learned about the student through a career interest inventory, for example, but it's not written as a compliant goal because it's missing those components I just mentioned. The second one, let's look at that. After high school, Sue will learn vocational skills in a post-high program. It's got the after high school, it's got the will, but the problem with this is it's written for what she'll do in post-high, which is an 18 to 22-year-old program, probably still back in her school district. This goal needs to be written for what she'll do after she leaves the school district. So it should be after post-high services end or after 22, Sue will work in a restaurant, let's say, right? Because this doesn't can we see her doing vocational skills? That's not a job. We need to see an actual outcome. Where will she work? So this is, again, some information, but it's not written as a compliant post-secondary goal. Let's look at the next one. The fall after graduation from high school, that statement's fine. Allison plans to enroll in Aggies Elevated. So again, plans isn't really active language. We ask ourselves, can we see her doing this, when she leaves? No. So we'd have to change that word to will or I will enroll, be enrolled in Aggies Elevated. So again, it's kind of, it might feel a little picky, but it has to have that active language to be compliant. And let's look at the last one. After high school, Jane should learn to dress herself. It's got the after high school statement, right? But again, it's should. So that's information, that's a need. So it sounds to me like Jane needs some instruction on how to dress herself. So that information should go in that summary of the transition assessment. And the goal should sound something more like after high school, Jane will dress herself every morning before going to work, something like that. So again, ask yourself when you're writing these, use the formula. Is this actually a goal? Does it have all the right components to it? Or is this just information that belongs somewhere else on the IEP, probably in the PLAFUP statement where those strengths, interests, preferences, and needs go? So there you go. Those are non-compliant examples. Okay, so this is Jason. So this is what Jason's post-secondary goals are, based on, you kind of know some of his spins already from watching the video. So after graduating from college, Jason will be employed as a history teacher. Now, this is interesting. It doesn't say after high school, right? It says after college. That's actually okay too. If the student wants to write their post-secondary goal for when they are done with their college, that's okay. It just has to be anytime after high school. So Jason chose to write it for what he ultimately will be doing after he's done with his degree from college, and that is to be a history teacher. So that's his dream. The second one is his post-secondary goal for education, and it says after graduating from high school, Jason will enroll in a 4-year college and major in teacher education program. So that is got all the components to be a compliant post-secondary goal for education and training. It says, that he'll attend college and even what he'll major in. Then he has an independent living goal, because through those assessments, we found out that, Jason's not super comfortable talking about his disability and his accommodations. So the team decided to write a goal for him around this idea of this independent living skill. So it reads, after graduating from high school, Jason will meet independently with the College Office of Student Support and discuss his need for accommodations before the fall semester begins. So this is kind of a tough thing sometimes for students with disabilities who have had an IEP and they've had a case manager and someone's always taking care of that stuff. Now they go to college, they have to advocate for themselves. They have to go seek out the Disability Service Center. They have to say, these are the accommodations I need. Let's make sure these are documented so I get my accommodation. So this is kind of sometimes a really tough thing for students. If they don't have practice with it in high school, then it's really hard to do in college. So this was a need. So Jason's, team decided they were going to write a goal for this. So when he gets to college, he will be able to do this, and hopefully he can practice this in high school and meet this post-secondary goal for independent living, that he can effectively kind of discuss his need for accommodations. So that's what it looks like for Jason. Let's watch this short video on Jason's post-secondary goals.
We just had my IEP meeting. Everyone was there. My parents, my teachers, my school counselor, the VR counselor, and this new person who will help me with what they call pre-employment transition services, or pre-ETS. It was kind of long, but worth it. We came up with some goals I can live with. My job goal is to become a teacher. So I will go to a 4-year college and major in history and teacher education. I brought up the fact that I work for my uncle, and when I told them I usually spend all my money before I get paid again, we decided to set a goal to help me budget my money. That's going to help me start saving for my future. We also set a goal to meet with a student support person at the college to talk about the accommodations I will need to succeed there. I really need to work on that last one. My IEP team said they would help me develop and practice strategies to become more confident so that when the time comes, I will be ready. The pre-ETS person said they could also help me with strategies to advocate for myself, just what I need. I'm so hyped about my future. Gotta run, basketball night.
Right, again, so you can see kind of that active.
We just
of Jason, creating his own post-secondary goals and kind of getting excited about that, right? So we feel that if students are really part of this process, they're going to be more invested and connected and see the reason for school. I think sometimes our students struggle and they just think, why am I learning these things, right? But if they're not directly connecting that to their exciting future, then then some of that can get lost, I think. So we're going to move on to the next section of the transition plan. So once we've established those future goals, those post-secondary goals, then there's a section on the transition plan, and it's right in the middle. And I like to call this literally like the meat and potatoes of the transition plan, because to me, this is like the good stuff. Like, we can write goals all day long, but if we don't really figure out, well, how does the student, reach that goal? What do we have to give them in terms of support and instruction and experiences so that they can meet that post-secondary goal, then what's the point, right? So for me, this transition services section is like where the rubber hits the road. This is like the good stuff, the stuff where we actually can provide for the student. And this is also, I think, the most confusing part of the transition plan. So we see all kinds of weird stuff in this section. There's been a lot of miscommunication and confusion around what the transition services are. So I hope to kind of clarify this for you. Back on the Canvas course, I provided you a link to a document called Transition Services Examples. And so we felt like out in the field, teachers just really didn't understand what is a transition service, right? And the cool thing is it can be so many things, but the hard thing is we have to really figure out, well, what makes the most sense for that student? What transition service do they need in this IEP year to get them closer to succeeding at that post-secondary goal? So I'll give you lots of examples, but essentially post-secondary transition services are, again, like I mentioned, they're targeted instruction. Sometimes they're related services. They're oftentimes community type experiences. They're some type of to help develop employment. So any kind of prerequisite type skill to make a student successful in employment would be that development of employment. And then, of course, daily living skills. So, anything around independent adult living type skills. So these are things that we're not just expecting the student to do on their own. We're not writing another goal for them. This is what is the community of adults. So that means the IEP team, teachers, even parents, outside agency providers. What are we going to give this student? What are we going to provide for them? So again, it could be counselors, it could be school club advisors, it could be outside agencies doing this. In some cases, parents. It's usually the school district that's providing this. And again, it's like we're giving these services to the student to help them progress towards actually realizing that post-secondary goal. So for example, the student wants to have a job, working with kids in a child care situation, right? Well, they have no experience. So we're going to have to give them maybe some instruction on how you apply for a job or put together a resume, or some instruction on what do employers expect? How do you communicate with an employer? So it's all those skills that we'd have to anticipate that they're going to need to be successful in their post-secondary goal, whatever that might be. So I'm going to give you examples. Again, I think it's really hard to look at this without examples. And then we have to make sure that there's alignment, right? So a post-secondary transition service for a student should align with that post-secondary goal, of course. And then, of course, it should make sense with what we have learned about the student through that transition assessment process. So all of this stuff needs to kind of align. This is a very short list of examples. That document that I mentioned has tons more examples, and it also puts those examples kind of in grade bands or age bands. What I mean by that is, let's say you're working with a 14-year-old student and you're thinking, gosh, what kind of transition service makes sense for a 14-year-old? That example document lists a whole bunch of potential or possible services that are appropriate for a younger student. And then it goes all the way through a student who is a senior, and then it goes beyond that. It goes into those 18 to 22-year-old, students that are staying for post-high. So again, short list, but what a transition service could be is support in arranging a tour of a post-secondary program. So let's say the student, they want to go to college, but they have no idea what's even available to them. So it could be that the special ed teacher arranges some tours of colleges, or maybe it's a pre-eds provider that arranges some tours, or maybe it's a school counselor. So again, what community, adults in the student support system can offer this service? Another example, maybe the student, has no idea how to contact disability service offices on a college campus. So they need to learn how to get online and start researching and contacting college disability services to find out, what do they need to bring with them to get that service. So that could be a a transition service, is supporting the student in that research, showing them how to do that. The next one, support in researching college scholarship opportunities. So let's say the barrier is a student really wants to go to college, but their parents don't have a college fund set up for them, right? And that's going to be an issue. So it would be instruction or support in how that student can research what opportunities, there are out there for scholarships. So that would be a transition service. Provide experience as an internship in the medical field. So let's say a student is super jazzed about working in a hospital, but they need some experience. So we could provide them, we could try to hook them up with an internship in some sort of a medical setting. That's a service. Support with studying for a driver's license. I had a student who that was their huge wish, was to, get a driver's license. They didn't get it in high school. They had a pretty significant disability. I had them in my post-high program. And so we did tons of practice tests and, read them out loud, did them online. I hooked them up with a community place that, you can get driving lessons. So again, that was a transition service for that student. The next one, support with applying for vocational rehabilitation. So we talk a lot about voc rehab. We'll get into more depth about what that service does, but it can do quite a bit for students in terms of helping them with getting a job, maintaining a job, support on the job. It can also help pay for college. So it's a pretty important service. And but there are some hoops you have to go through to apply. So if I were to support a student through that process, that would be considered a transition service. And then instruction and budgeting. So Jason mentioned he spends all his money when he gets paid. So maybe the student needs some actual instruction on how to do budgeting, weekly, daily, online banking, those kinds of things. That's a transition service. Instruction in healthcare and self-sufficiency. So maybe the student doesn't understand, how to make doctor's appointments, how to manage their meds, those kinds of things. That can be a transition service. I'm trying to give you lots of different examples of varieties of transition services. There needs to be one aligned with each post-secondary goal. So you'll see if the student has 2 post-secondary goals, there has to at least be 2 transition services. And so you want to kind of have examples, I think, of different ways that we can provide transition services to students. So second to last one, instruction, experience, or support in using public transportation. So if the student's goal is to go to college or, get to their part-time job, but they don't have a driver's license, they're going to need some instruction or support, experience, get out there, ride UTA or whatever the bus system, might be in their own community. That's a transition service. And then the last one, instruction in 504 and ADA accommodation. So we talk a lot about when students leave school, IDEA goes away. But there are other laws out there, right, that protect them in terms of their disability and allows accommodations. And those laws are either 504, if it's like a college, for example, that receives public funds, that's where 504 comes in. And then there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and that falls into place everywhere in the workplace and in the community setting. So it's important for students to know what are their rights. What does the law say about accommodations and access, right, under IDEA? Under 504 and ADA. So a lot of times students need explicit instruction around that. That can be a transition service, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is considered compliant and what is non-compliant. So on the compliance side, in that left box, again, it's a service that is provided by the LEA, by that group of adults, to support the student that in that actual annual transition plan year to help them get closer to their post-secondary goals. So the instruction should be aligned, the activities should be aligned, the experiences should be aligned, right? They should make sense. The student wants to be a welder, then we will want to give them some kind of a transition service that helps them get ready for that. And then that hyperlink there, the USPE transition service examples, that's that document that I separately linked in the Canvas course. So please take a look at that, because I think that's super helpful when you're writing these. Okay, non-compliant. These are some things that we sometimes see in this section of the transition plan that we would consider not compliant. Don't make sense. Sometimes we used to see goal numbers kind of cross-referenced in here, and people would just list numbers of annual goals. Don't do that. That is considered not compliant. We're not seeing much of that anymore in the state, but for a while we were seeing that practice a lot. So we don't want to reference any goals. We don't want to write annual goals in this section. We don't want to put numbers of goals in there. We also don't want to just see a list of classes. So sometimes we'll see, oh, the student should take, I don't know, financial literacy, math class, and English class. Well, it's like that goes somewhere else. That's called the courses of study. It's not a targeted transition service. It's just a list of classes. Does not belong in the transition services section. So know that. And then there used to be boxes on the transition plan where you could just check considered not needed. That's not okay either, right? The student has to have a post-secondary goal in education, and they have to have a post-secondary goal in employment. Therefore, there has to be a transition service related to each one of those goals, and it has to be written out. And then the last one, I kind of showed you some examples, but what we don't want to see in the transition services section is just pluff up statements. Like the student should do this, the student, should get a job. The student should take this class in budgeting. We don't want that kind of a thing in the transition services, because that doesn't talk about what the community of adults is giving or providing them. This is really about what we are providing them, not what they should do, right? So making that clear, hopefully. So here are some actual examples I pulled from some IEPs. So I pulled an IEP from a school district, and under the transition services section for this student, it said they need communication skills, reading, math, money skills. So that's pretty vague. Like if I were to pick up that IEP and I would think to myself, okay, what kind of communication skills does this student need? Like, is it speech? Is it written communication? Is it texting? They need reading and math. Like, is that functional? What level? Like, there's just not, right? It's not really, there's nothing specific there. And they need money skills. Well, that's huge, right? Like there's so much around money skills. So how do we make these transition services individualized, targeted, so that if I were to pick up this IEP, I would know what to do with the student? So here's some possibilities. Instruction in answering and sending text messages. So maybe the student just doesn't respond to text, doesn't know how to write text, doesn't know how to use speech to text, for example. Maybe they can't. So that's the targeted transition service. Maybe it's that the student doesn't know how to ask for help at work. So it's instruction and practice on how to appropriately ask for help at work. Maybe they're super shy. Maybe that's their communication need. So see how we just went from communication skills really broadly to something much more specific. That's what we want to see in transition services. Again, reading. What kind of reading does the student need? Well, if they want to live on their own, they need some instruction and reading and adjusting recipes. So, learning how to read and understand what measurements mean in recipes. So that's a targeted transition skill. And then again, money skills, that was super vague. So let's make that more specific. Experience in using a variety of tools for monthly budgeting. So maybe the student needs to be introduced to, like a spreadsheet for budgeting, or an app, or how to access online banking. So again, a lot more specific to the need of the student. So that's what we want to see for transition services. Here's a second example from a real IEP. This IEP had listed for the transition service, again, vague kinds of things like communication skills, cleaning skills, job training. We don't know what kind of job training, learning about VR. So again, super vague. I wouldn't really know exactly what to do if I were to pick up this, transition plan to give this student the service they need. So let's see if we can refine that and make it a little more specific. So instruction and practice making food choices by using a switch. So this is a student, doesn't use verbal communication. They're have some pretty significant support needs. And their communication skills is just making choices and then using that switch. Do you want to have peanut butter and jelly for lunch, or do you want to have mac and cheese? Right. So that would be the targeted transition services instruction on how to make choices using a switch. Maybe the cleaning skills part is the student needs to learn how to vacuum, their house or their room. So again, instead of just cleaning skills, this is a much more targeted transition service. And then in terms of job skills, it says job training. Well, this student happened to be really interested in animals, so we wanted to give them an experience at like an animal shelter, but they needed some instruction and practice on how to use a pet brush so that they could brush the cats and dogs at the shelter. So again, targeted transition service to help them with their post-secondary goal of possibly working or volunteering at a animal shelter, for example. And then maybe this student was also for their kind of vocational skills was doing a job try at a restaurant, but they needed specific instructions on how to use a checklist. So maybe it was a visual checklist where they would, have to go get the mop and then fill up the bucket and then, squeeze out the mop and mop a certain area. So again, like following that checklist, that's a instruction that can be a targeted transition service. And then that last one, again, up above, it says learning about VR. Well, what really has to happen there, right? So maybe it's actually support in applying for that VR service. So that could look a couple different ways. It could be, there's a video out there to teach people about VR. I have actually driven students to the VR office to apply. I've also asked VR counselors to come to my classroom and actually sit down and start the application process. So kind of whatever the needs of the student and family are, that can look different. So again, support in actually applying for the service, not just learning about it, right? Because we want them to get connected. So that's the difference between sort of these very vague services and much more specific ones that we would want to see. Okay, I mentioned that transition services example document. There's also what we call a pre-employment transition service brochure. And I'll show you that too. I think that's in the next one. Oh, this is just a screenshot of what you'll find on that transition services examples document. And it's like several pages. This just shows 8th grade under employment and education and training. And then I said it goes all the way up to age 22. So this is just a quick little screenshot of what that looks like, but please check out that document. And then pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services, they are free services that are available to students all throughout the state. They are paid for by vocational rehabilitation, but they are oftentimes provided by different outside providers that have a contract with VR. And these are the 5 core services. And you can see like so much of this we've talked about, right? So we know students need some job exploration and counseling. They need some workplace readiness skills. Work-based learning experience is huge. We talked about how important that is. If students have work-based learning experiences, they'll have better outcomes. Counseling on post-secondary education. So essentially what that means is like teaching kids what their options are after high school in terms of post-secondary education. And then there's that self-advocacy again, kind of it's everywhere, right? So these are the 5 core services that are offered to students throughout the state. Sometimes these are done in a class, sometimes they are done individually, sometimes they happen in the community, sometimes they happen at a school. They can look different kind of depending upon where you live, where the student lives, what the service is available to them. But know that these are available to any student and family in the state without having to pay for them. It's just a matter of connecting, right? So it's a matter of building relationships with these services and these providers and connecting students and family to these. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. But there's this brochure, and I've linked that too in the slide, and I've linked it here. This is a brochure that shows throughout our state who provides what service where. This is just the first kind of page of this brochure. It goes on to actually, explain how you get in contact with these services. So you may already be familiar, you may already have relationships with these providers in your setting, and you may not. So if you have more questions about this, we can, you can certainly reach out to me. Otherwise, I think this will come up as a theme. So I'll probably embed more Priettes kind of talk as we go through this semester. Okay, so let's take a look at Jason's transition services. So remember, he wants to be a history teacher. He wants to go to college. So what does he need to help him get to those goals? So for employment, he needs some support in researching the requirements for employment as a high school teacher. So he kind of needs to figure out, well, I guess I got to go to college for 4 years, but what does student teaching look like? What courses am I going to have to take? What is the, the praxis, like my student teaching? What is that all going to look like? So he needs some support around figuring that all out before he makes his decision. And then for education and training, support in completing college applications, right? So he's got to start that process. So a lot of times, yes, counselors help with that, but a lot of times our students with disabilities need more targeted types of instruction around this. So that could be something that a special ed teacher provides, but maybe the Priettes provider helps with that, sits down with him and actually helps him through those college applications. And then for independent living skills, his targeted transition service is experience leading his own IEP meeting. He is reluctant a little bit to talk about accommodations, and I think it's a good experience for all students to kind of be very active participants in their IEP and actually lead them, especially by the time they're a junior or a senior. And my thought is they should be almost running the meeting, right? If they have those skills, and it takes some time, but so this could look like a teacher kind of teaching him the components of the transition plan, starting for him to start talking about his spins and his goals, and essentially kind of driving the transition process at his meeting. So those are his services. Let's watch his video real quick.
I've been thinking about the goals we set in my IEP meeting and how my team will help me practice asking for accommodations. I also remembered I'm going to get help researching what it takes to be a high school teacher, so I know what I'm getting myself into. And get this, I'll get to job shadow a teacher to learn all about their job. My counselor said he would help me fill out college applications. And my study skills teacher said she would help me work up to leading my own IEP meeting. That last one really makes me nervous. But I have a lot of support, and I feel good about that. I wonder what's for dinner tonight. I'm gonna go find out.
All right, again, so just an example of, Jason really understanding not only like these goals that he set for himself, but how does he get there, and what skills and experiences does he still need to successfully get there? And I think when students know that, then they know themselves better, and they know their strengths and their needs. So that's an example of Jason's understanding what his transition service needs are and who's going to provide those on his team. Okay, we're going to shift gears again. Now we're getting to the section of the transition plan called courses of study. And in the colorful flow chart is that yellow box where it says courses of study. And there are a couple different ways that a person can be compliant in this area, right? So this is kind of language pulled right off of the transition plan. So it says, and it's number 6, is the 6th section of the transition plan. It says courses of study addressing post-secondary transition needs for post-secondary adult service activities. So this should be a multi-year reviewed and revised annually that specifies the educational courses and experiences that will assist the student in achieving the student's post-secondary goals. This information may be contained in the Plan for College and Career Readiness, or often called the PCCR, and that's something that school counselors are supposed to do with students starting in 8th grade and throughout high school, and or the Student Education Occupation Plan. I don't know if many schools still call them SEOPs. I think most schools call them now the PCCR plan, which, if used to meet this requirement, must be attached. Okay, so this is a lot of words, right? So essentially what this is saying is the courses of study have to show kind of a mapped out plan of what the student is going to take for courses all the way up to graduation. So let's say here's Jason, he's 16, he's probably in 10th grade. We don't want to just list courses he's going to take in 10th. We would want to list, you know, what's he taking in 11th, what's he taking in 12th, and let's say he's taking like a whole series of CTE courses, right? Or he's got to take language because to get into college, he needs 2 years of language. So we want to be really mindful of making sure that we are, you know, we have students enrolled in the right classes first and foremost for graduation, but also thinking about post-secondary education. So there's several different ways we can do that. We can literally type and list out all the classes, but that's kind of a long way to do it. The easiest way to do it is if you can get a hold of that student's PCCR plan. And like I said, every student should have one of these from 8th grade all the way on that they've done with their counselor, mapping out their courses of they're going to take throughout high school. That can be attached to the IEP if there's a current copy of it. That can meet the requirements for this course of study. That's kind of the easiest way, but there are some other ways. And again, that multi-year description. So it needs to be kind of specific and individualized to the student. So if the student wants to go to art school after high school, we don't want to be putting them in a bunch of welding classes, right? Like we would want to see that they are going to be in a series of art classes. So that's what we mean by individualized to the student, considering their preferences and interests and some, you know, classes that will reasonably enable that student to reach those post-secondary goals. So again, let's talk about how you can be compliant in this. So like I mentioned, the first way is to write out all the courses the student's going to take from that year that they're in all the way up to the year that they exit. That's kind of the long way to do it. You can do it that way, but most people don't. Let's look at the second option. It's acceptable to write a statement in this section of the transition plan that says all classes, like the student will take all classes to satisfy a high school diploma at Ben Lomond High School, for example, right? And then you would also want to list out those elective classes or the CTE classes or those kind of specific classes that align with the student's post-secondary goal. So that's option 2, is you write that statement. They're going to take all these classes for graduation, and then these specific ones they've chosen that align with their interests. The third one is by far the easiest. If you have access, again, to that college and career readiness plan that they've written with hopefully their parent was there too, but with their school counselor, and you write on the transition plan itself, see the PCCR plan for the course of study. You absolutely can do that. So a lot of times those plans for college and career readiness are in the files that your school counselor holds. You could get a copy of that. Some schools have it electronically on their SIS system, so you might be able to pull it from there. And if that's the case, you know, great, you can attach it, print it, attach it, put it in the student's file. So those are the 3 different ways that courses of study need to be documented. But I think the big takeaway here is there has to be a multi-year course of study. So what is the student taking, not just this year, but all the way upon exit? Does it align with their interests and preferences? Because that's something we look at to make sure it makes sense and that it's individualized and not just like generic for every single student on your caseload. So hopefully that's clear enough. And then, of course, effective practices. So sometimes schools have some kind of funky names for classes. And so what we mean by the stranger test is if a student comes from a charter school, they have sometimes really unique classes and they name them something that no one else knows. So if you are in that situation, just kind of be more transparent about what that course is, right? So think about that stranger test. If the student moves tomorrow and they go to a new school, is that school going to be able to figure out their courses of study by what you have listed? So that's kind of that stranger test idea. Okay, let's look at Jason talking about his courses of study.
At my IEP meeting today, we made a list of elective courses I can take in my last 2 years of high school. My counselor is going to help me develop my plan for college and career readiness, including a concurrent enrollment course in world history. I'm nervous about that, but it could be cool. I'm also going to sign up for Spanish 1 and 2 because I know I will need that to get into college. I wonder if I should try to take an AP history course. I'll have to sleep on that one.
All right, so it's important that the student themselves is like involved in this process of what do they need for their goals after high school, right? So what kinds of courses are going to make sense if they want to go to college? A lot of times students will get to college and have to do lots of remediation classes because they haven't taken the right ones in high school. So this is a super important area. So just like he mentioned in 11th grade, Jason's going to take world history and Spanish 2, and then in 12th grade, he's going to try that concurrent enrollment college class for history, and then he's going to take Spanish 3 because he knows to get into a 4-year college, he needs those 2 years of a foreign language. And the statement above where it says Jason will meet all the requirements to graduate from district high school, Jason will take these elective courses to align. So this is a perfect example of meeting the requirements for courses and study. It says he's going to take all the required classes so that he graduates on time. And then in addition, he needs to take these specific classes because they make sense for his plan for the future. It could have just said, see the CCR plan if all of this information was on there, that would have been fine too. But that's not how this was written. So either way is fine. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the requirement for an annual IEP goal. What's a little confusing about this is we do look to see that at least one of the students' annual IEP goals on the rest of the IEP align with and support the students' post-secondary goals. So I think don't get too tripped up. This annual goal required for transition is not in the transition plan. It's back in the IEP wherever those annual goals live in the IEP. So what we do is we, ask the question, is there an annual goal that supports the student's post-secondary goal? Now, in most cases, all of the annual goals have some connection to the post-secondary goals, right? So like a student has a goal to increase their reading skills, for example, that's probably going to help them in a job someday, or probably going to help them, in college, for example. But what's even better is if we see a goal written kind of for their transition service needs, not so much for the academic part necessarily. So the question here around compliance is which annual IEP goal is related to the student's post-secondary transition service needs. So for example, Jason has a transition service need to be more comfortable talking about his accommodation. So maybe we'll have an annual goal that will say that, well, he's got to go talk to 2 teachers each semester and tell them what his accommodations are, right? That would be an example of an annual goal that's really targeted around this idea of a transition service need. So let's give you some examples of what this might look like. How do you write an annual goal? Well, I think everyone knows you probably all have had, lots of practice writing annual goals. But again, in this context of transition, we need to make sure that at least one of those annual goals that's written reasonably links to that transition service need. And it should be individualized and based on the student's specific needs, and it must be written in an observable and measurable way. We're not going to get into annual IEP goal writing because I believe you've probably done that in other classes. So we won't quite go there yet. But again, to meet basic compliance, we just have to see that at least one annual goal really connects with the student's post-secondary goals, and it's considered compliant. So this isn't a hard area to meet compliance on the transition plan by any means, but to go above and beyond, I think we really want to look at, does it make sense to create a specific annual goal for transition only. So not academic, but specifically to transition. And we'll give you some examples. It could be a social skills goal. It could be a behavioral goal, you know, maybe it's showing up to their work site on time. Maybe it's to, you know, communicate with their supervisor at their job, those kinds of things. So think of transition annual IEP goals as, you know, those goals that are not academic, but they're kind of addressing all of these transition service needs. And effective practice is that each annual goal would directly and specifically link to that student's post-secondary goal. So just, you know, making sure that there's alignment. We don't want to write an annual goal for a student that doesn't connect really to their post-secondary goals. So I'm not going to read all of these, but I'll read a couple of them. These are just examples of annual IEP goals that are really transition focused. So let's look at, okay, let's look at the first one. Given direct instruction on the use of budgeting spreadsheets, a checklist of items to include in a monthly budget, and 3 case studies, Sophia will create a monthly budget for each case study with 100% accuracy by the end of third quarter, as measured by the monthly budgeting checklist. So again, maybe the student has a need for budgeting. The transition service is you're going to provide some instruction for budgeting. But we want to see, well, is the student actually going to gain some skills? So we're going to write a goal for this and hold the student accountable for, you know, using these budget spreadsheets and understanding budgeting. We'll do one more. Let's look at the last one. Given instruction on leading an IEP meeting. So you're going to provide some different ways and maybe role play with the student, how they would lead their own IEP meeting. Carlos will use the Transition Elevated Planning app, and I haven't shared that with you guys yet, but I will. There's a certain app that we've developed that students can use to help lead their own IEPs. So Carlos will use the Transition Elevated Planning app or some other tool to lead his post-secondary transition IEP meeting by the end of the school year. So let's say he's got an IEP meeting in March, and we wrote this goal, you know, the March before, that he's going to receive some instruction on how to lead his own IEP meeting. And there's lots of different tools out there. And we'll do that when we do our unit on student-driven IEPs. But then the goal is that, you know, we're holding him accountable to actually leading his own IEP that following March. So those are just examples of annual goals that are really targeted to a transition service need, students' needs. Okay, so let's look at what Jason's annual IEP goal. So given instruction and self-advocacy skills, because remember, this is something that's sort of lacking for him. He's not comfortable. Examples and practice opportunities in effective verbal communication. Jason will demonstrate 100% efficiency over 3 consecutive instances in verbally requesting his to his teachers what accommodations he'll need for writing assignments. So again, he's going to we're going to role play with them. We're going to teach him, you know, how to best communicate his accommodation needs. But then his goal that we're going to actually take data on and measure is did he actually reach out to, you know, several of his students and have a conversation with his, his teachers, have a conversation with his teachers and, you know, let them know what his transition service needs are. Or his accommodations, I mean. So that's what that annual goal is. All right. Okay, so let's watch him talk about his annual goal.
One of the things my IEP team helped me figure out at our meeting yesterday is what I need to work on during this school year. Since my biggest hurdle is asking for accommodations, we decided that for my annual IEP goal, I will practice communication skills by doing role plays with my teacher and pre-ETS instructor. And by the end of the third quarter, I should be able to ask all of my teachers for the accommodations I need. My teacher will observe me and use the same checklist we use in our role plays to measure how well I communicate. I think this will really help me ask for what I need to do well in my classes.
So again, an example of an annual IEP goal that really directly related to Jason's transition service needs. It's not just an academic goal, like improve reading. So that's an effective practice, is to do that. Okay, so now we are on the last section really of our component, we like to say, of the transition plan itself. And that is that question around this coordination with outside agencies. So that's the bottom, that's that purple box at the bottom. Why is this so important? So this is what it looks like on the form itself. It says, are the post-secondary transition services, experiences, and or specialized instruction listed above likely to be provided or paid for by other agencies? Now, I'm not a huge fan of this statement because I wish it just said, hey, let's connect students and families to outside agencies and which ones make sense for them and which ones are relevant. That's kind of how it used to be. But the word has changed, the verbiage has changed on the transition plan, unfortunately, I think, because I think sometimes it's confusing and it shies people away from checking the box yes. But you'll notice on your own forms or on the sample forms that I provided, this is how the question is posed. So basically it's saying, is there a need for an outside agency to provide or pay for these services? Now, sometimes people are afraid and they just check no because they think, how can I, as an LEA, obligate an outside service? But here's an example. Let's say you brought the VR counselor in or the pre-ETS provider, and they're going to take the student to go tour some colleges, right? That isn't paid for by the school district. It's not paid for by the parents. It's paid for by another agency, but they're providing that service, right? So we would want to check yes here. If you check the yes box, that's great. That's what we want because we really want to help connect students and families with outside agencies. We want to kind of blend and braid services. However, when you check the yes box, by law, it requires that you then also get permission from the parents prior to inviting that outside agency to the IEP meeting. So it is kind of one more step. Sometimes what school districts will do and teachers will do is they'll get that consent form signed at the beginning of the school year with just about all their students if they plan to invite either a pre-employment transition service provider or a vocational rehabilitation or some other agency. So it is something you kind of can do, prior, like at the beginning of the school year. So you've kind of done it for all the IEPs. But we really encourage this idea of, like I said, transition isn't a solo event. Like there are so many services out there that can help the student. So why would we not want to invite outside agencies? It just takes some coordination. So let's take a look at, and talk a little bit about, what that means. So what we see a lot in the state is almost everyone just checks the box no. And I think they check the box no because there's either confusion, like, I don't really know what this means. I don't know who to invite. Or it does trigger that one more step of getting consent. And so people don't have time for it, or they just don't do it. But we overwhelmingly see this no. But we would love to change that. So we're kind of saying, all right, if you're just going to say no, I don't need to have an outside agency come to this IEP meeting. Again, what's the basis for that decision? Why are you saying the student can't benefit from pre-ETS or VR? We believe that just about every student with an IEP can benefit from those services. So again, it'll make your IEP, I think, more defensible. So in other words, if there's ever kind of a dispute situation around this and the boxes just checked no, and there's really no thought behind it as to why you said no, it's not needed, it could come back to bite you. So I think it's, err on the side of caution and really think about outside agencies, have conversations with parents and say, hey, would you like me to invite the VR counselor? Or this thing called pre-ETS can be really helpful. Can I invite them? And then of course, make sure you get that consent. So that is kind of like my little spiel on outside agencies. But there has to be documentation that at least another agency was considered. So you have to check either yes or no, or you can't even print the IEP, right? And you've probably found that out yourselves. But if appropriate, is there evidence that a representative of any other agency was invited to the IEP team meeting with the prior consent of a parent or student if the students reach age of majority? So what that means is obviously if the student's 18 and they're their own guardian, they get to make this decision, right? They can sign the form that says, yes, bring an outside agency rep to my IEP meeting. Of course, if the parents have guardianship or they're under 18, then that goes to the parent. So there has to be written consent. I mean, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You could probably do it electronically. You can print it and put it in the student's backpack or whatever. But there has to be that written consent. It can't just be verbal. It can be an email, but that would have to be printed if the parent consented, written through an email. That could be printed and put into the IEP to show that there was prior consent before inviting. And that the date has to be prior to the IEP meeting. So we can't see the date on the day of the IEP meeting. It has to be prior to that, even if it's the day before. So that's kind of the compliance part, of this idea of inviting an outside agency rep. I think more importantly is like knowing why we want to do this, right? So I've put vocational rehabilitation at the top, and the reason for that is this is the service and agency throughout our state that is probably the most applicable to all students with an IEP. So what I mean by that is just by nature of the fact that they have an IEP means they have a documented disability, means they'll qualify for this service called vocational rehabilitation. That's not the case with the other services listed here necessarily, right? So VR is kind of the obvious one. It's like the big one. It's one that can help with employment, with internships, paid internships, job shadows. It can help with, welding materials if the student's going into welding. It can help pay for college. It can help pay for, in some cases, glasses, medical devices. Like there's a lot that VR can do that sometimes people don't realize. It is not a service just for students with complex needs. It's a service for even a student on a 504 plan. So it's any student that has a documented disability that has some sort of a barrier to employment can qualify. So that's why VR is the big one. And that's why we talk about it a ton. A couple of the other services, Division of Services for People with Disabilities, also known as DSPD. That service is also a state agency. You might have heard that it's got kind of a long wait list. That is true, but we still encourage students with complex needs. So what I mean by that is a student, to qualify for DSP, you have to have pretty significant disability. So there has to be a cognitive disability, and in some cases physical disabilities, but really it's more about a cognitive disability. So a lot of students that have the disability category of intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, maybe students with autism, if they also have an intellectual disability, would qualify for this service. But it's a lifelong service. Once the student gets it, it can help with housing, whether that be supported living, group home. It can help with community access, recreation, doing things in the community. And then of course with employment too. They have job coaches and things. Then there's the Department of Workforce Services, and they have lots of different new kinds of programs, services. They do internships, they do some GED kinds of things if the student didn't finish their diploma, resume building. There's a lot of services under DWS, so that could be one. Maybe if the student has mental health needs, you bring somebody in from the local mental health authority to provide, whatever supports they can provide, whether that be in the form of counseling or support, like group, what do you call that? Like a group support situation. And then there are CRPs, and those are community rehab providers. So they're the ones that actually do things like job coaching or provide in-home supports. So those are kind of agencies that are funded by DSPD or VR, but they actually provide the service. So you could invite someone from there if the student's already connected or needs to be connected. And then of course, disability resource centers at the colleges. So you can invite somebody from those disability resource centers. They can come to IEPs with plenty of notice to talk about, what a student would have to do to get services, what the college life is like as a student with a disability. So, and again, this is not an end-all be-all list. Like any other agency service, something in the community that makes sense. You could even invite an employer to an IEP meeting, for example. So it's always great, I think, to just learn about these services, and we will talk about this more. So I think you'll get a better idea of what's out there, and then start talking to parents early about this. Oftentimes parents don't have like a social worker case manager to help them connect with all of this, and they might look to you as that person to help them understand these services and connect. So I'm going to provide you with a ton of resources on how to do that. But I think it's in your best interest to really kind of know what's out there, spend some time on their websites, figure out what they offer so that you can talk to parents about it. That's huge. Okay. So for Jason, let's see, the box was checked yes for coordinating with outside agencies. A vocational rehabilitation counselor is going to come to his meeting, and then it says logistics specialties. That's short for that is called LSI. That's one of our pre-ETS providers in our state. And that pre-ETS provider is going to come to the meeting and talk about what services they provide. So let's listen to Jason's outside agency connections.
I've been thinking about the VR counselor and pre-ETS person at my IEP meeting yesterday. I knew they were coming because my teacher and my parents and I talked a few months ago about inviting them. My teacher showed us some videos on VR and pre-ETS and then asked if they could be invited to the meeting. I really wanted that, so we all agreed to it. I had forgotten about it until they showed up, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember inviting them after I saw the videos. And I didn't realize that not only can they help me while I'm still in high school, they can also help me after I graduate. They've got my back big time. I think more people should know about this. Got a minute to see my counselor before class. See ya.
I think, students and families to be introduced to these outside agencies, and it's not just a quick one and done. Like, it takes a while, I think, for parents to understand, like, what the service provides, how is that relevant to their student, when those services make the most sense. So sometimes they need to hear it time and time again, and we have different ways of sharing that, right? So there's pamphlets out there, there's videos out there. All of this is connected on a website that I'm going to share with you too. Again, I think the best thing to do is find out who your assigned counselor is. Every single high school in the state has a liaison VR counselor connected to that high school that you can reach out to. And I would say, develop a relationship with them. So here is other outside agency resources. So these links go to those things I just talked about, that VR liaison list at each high school. If you are at a middle school, they don't assign a VR liaison counselor to middle schools. However, if you wanted a VR counselor to show up, they absolutely could with plenty of notice. You would have to call the local office nearest to your school. And they could provide a counselor to come to an IEP meeting, or even just come to a meeting at the school, or parent teacher conference, or however you want to utilize them essentially to connect with students and families. You could do that. Okay, there's that introduction videos. That's a really good place to start to kind of learn what VR does, that general introduction video and information page. So these are all kind of separate links that go to the state VR website. All right, so we're going to wrap things up. Here again, we just kind of went through the whole process, and looking at that top box where it says meaningful student participation in this process, we saw how that happened with Jason, right? It can look different. I mean, if you are working with students with complex needs, it's probably not going to be necessarily like Jason, who had verbal skills and was kind of on this like traditional path of graduation and college. That is not always the case, right? But it doesn't mean that students can't be part of this whole process, right? And the reason we do all these things really intentionally is that we want students to have better outcomes. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this essentially kind of shows the alignment. So that green column on the left are his post-secondary goals in all those three areas. And then you see alignment across this grid, essentially, what the services are like, the courses of study, the annual IEP goal, the outside agency. So it's kind of just putting it all together just in a different format. The takeaways, we talk so much about starting transition early, making sure that we're always assessing and thinking about self-determination because it's such an important area. Gather sufficient information, those transition assessments, we spent 2 weeks on those. So hopefully you feel pretty comfortable with that and where to go to get tools to use to gather all those rich, spins that we want. And then, just to be clear, some people used to say, well, why am I writing these post-secondary goals? that the student might go to college, and if they don't end up doing that, are we liable, you know, as a teacher, as a LEA, that they didn't meet their post-secondary goals? But just so you all know, we're responsible for writing those post-secondary goals in a compliant way, but we are not necessarily held to those outcomes. So in other words, you're not going to get in trouble if you write a goal that a student's going to go on to college and it doesn't actually happen. Of course, we want that to happen, but there's no legal, you know, recourse there if they don't. And again, we know that those, you know, post-secondary goals can be adjusted annually. But just wanted to throw that out there so everyone knows. Okay, so we'll watch Jason's wrap up.
I feel good about my plan for this year. I feel like I have more focus on what I need to work on and how to use my strengths to make more progress in school and for my future. I know I still have 2 more years of high school, but with the help I'm getting from my IEP team, I know I can become more confident and reach my goals. Time for basketball.
And that's it. So I do want to mention again, I put a lot on the Canvas page for this week, but there is, along with that tips document, the examples for the transition services. I believe I also put on there a worksheet, and it's got lots of colorful stuff, but essentially what that worksheet is designed for is that if you are developing transition plans, or you want to go back and look at ones you've written to say, gosh, you know, did I do this right? Is it compliant? How can I improve it? That worksheet is basically divided up into those sections or components of the transition plan, and it has kind of these little guiding questions. So in other words, use that worksheet either when you develop a new transition plan for a student, or you want to go back and see, you know, learn kind of from what you have been doing and how you can improve moving forward. So it's essentially kind of to help with compliance and quality, and it's just a guide so that you're not just trying to figure out yourself, you know, how do I improve this transition plan, or how do I make sure I'm compliant? The worksheet is there for you. All right, I know that was a lot, but I really wanted to cover kind of the rest of the plan. I felt like it flowed really, you know, well after learning so much about transition assessments. So hopefully you've all found that helpful, and I'll see you next week. Y'all, thanks. Bye-bye.